Hey, welcome back to Guardbeardia. Good to have you back here again for the next chapter of the Veil Riders, but before we get to that I want to let you know that I got a Redbubble open. So here you can come here, buy your stickers, and all kinds of other weird stuff you might be interested in. I got all kinds of stuff up on here, and I reduced all the prices manually, so that way prices are nice and low. You guys can afford things more easily, all kinds of fun stuff. But you got anything from t-shirts to stickers to mugs and masks. I'm kind of tempted to get a mask myself, not gonna lie. Also, the patches are in production and should be shipped here soon within the next couple of days, I hope. They're kind of dragging their feet due to the whole corona thing, but hopefully the patches will be here soon, and I'll make an announcement when they're ready to buy on the patch site. And again, I'm keeping all orders from being shipped on the site until the patches come in, so that way if you order a Veil Rider patch, you won't be charged twice for shipping. But that's enough housekeeping for now. Let's go ahead and get going with the story. Chapter 12. Yule blinked away the raindrops that ran down the bill of his patrol cap and gave a soft snort of annoyance. It seemed that no matter when or where he was, it always wanted to rain when he was lying in wait during an ambush. He looked down the line of riflemen that were hiding along the same natural berm that he was hunkered down behind, and couldn't help but crack a wry grin. What a bunch of Lord of the Rings bullshit this is. All along the berm were strewn valley elves, dwarves, brim-touched and oni, and his own Veil Riders. A mishmash of gear, uniforms, weapons, and armor. Yule was direly behind schedule for his operations, and really wanted to get out into the fields sooner, but even he knew he had a manpower problem. When the call for volunteers went out over the mailed network, able-bodied men and women from the cities surrounding Norris came in droves to be drilled into competent, if green, Veil Rider infantry auxiliaries. Yule was grateful for the confederation that these people had set up hundreds of years before, which allowed him to dip his hand into all the cultures at once. Not only was the outpost, now named Valhalla Hill due to the carvings and scrollworks the dwarves and Brimtouch put up about the place, a huge fob of its own accord, but stretched all the way down to the bottom of the hill, resembling some kind of weird postmodern fortification town. Except, where buildings and markets should have been, there were instead pillboxes, kill holes, and workshops where weapons were maintained or even created. Yule was actually quite taken aback by how many of the Veil folk showed up to volunteer, and took to having them drilled in the arts of riflery and basic platoon-based tactics. He even took the training of the auxiliary NCOs into his own hands, and held many a late-night classroom sessions where he put the amulet to good use. Yethus was also helping him get more of his Tunka down pat, drilling him on basic phrases as he drilled the folk around him. Yule looked over to Yethus, who was grumbling irritably as rain dripped in fat drops from her own patrol cap and hair braid. Yethus had been christened the top shirt of the Healer Corps, with Gruesome serving as the overall command sergeant major and instructing them on basic combat casualty care, how to pack their medical kits, as well as headlining more advanced forms of combat medicines. Yethus herself preened for days after she was given the rank, and continuously made sure the other healers called her First Sergeant. Thankfully, the Oni were skilled weavers, and were able to crank out the majority of the U.S. Army ranks that were required to sew onto uniforms for designations. The Oni were actually taking up a lot of the textile workload, along with the Valley Elves, and now there could be found professional-looking uniforms on this side of the Veil, designed by the well-loved Armstrong. They were mirrored after the U.S. Army Standard Battle Dress uniform of the 1980s, but in a solid moss-type color that was as close as they could get to OD green. In addition to these uniforms, there were also fresh unit patches being made for the auxiliary as well, now sharing the same unit brotherhood of the Veil Riders. The only ones who did not partake in the unit patch were the 601st, but everyone was more than happy to let them make their own decisions. The 601st themselves took a keen interest in some of the volunteers that came in from the surrounding countryside, and picked out a trooper here or there that showed promise in the more ungentlemanly aspects of combat. They themselves had recreations of their own unit patch, and now consisted of a small platoon of troopers that operated on their own accord. Yule had no problems with this, and just asked Prusik to make sure to watch out for the Vale folk. Prusik had no arguments with this request, and kept Yule up to date on their comings and goings from Valhalla Hill. The 601st platoon was actually why they were all out here hugging this berm, watching the opening from a forest while the rain pelted down from on high. The 601st's recon outings allowed them to stumble upon a large company of infantry moving north from Sanrion, and spent some length of time harassing them during the night, even going as far as to take out an entire squad in their sleep, and leaving the bleeding bodies in their bedrolls to be discovered the morning after. The 601st, however, did not have the manpower to take out an entire company, as they were traveling with 2 LGS Phoenix and an M1117 ASV. When the male brush-feathered landed down near the command bunker and told Yule the news, he scrabbled together an ambush force and immediately set out. His aim to take the vehicles whole and undamaged, so they could make use of them themselves. And it was those vehicles they waited on, soggy and laying in the grass as patiently as they could. The dwarven machine gunners chuckled and drank from their flasks, manning a Veil Rider M240 Bravo, while the brim-touched and Oni took the time to perfect the camo netting they had draped around their horns. The 1st Dragoons all lounged in the spitting rain, a few having dragged tarpaulins over themselves to try and stay as dry as they could manage. Yethis saddled up next to Yule, shaking the water from her rifle as she did, and grumped softly. "I'm cold," she murmured, and Yule felt her snuggle up next to him. "Hi, Cold. I'm Yule," he said back with a grin, and she punched him in the shoulder with the wet splack of rain-sodden clothing. Yule looked down at her rifle as he rubbed his shoulder, and couldn't help but marvel at it. The dwarves had done a remarkable job copying the Daewoo K2, but instead of plastic, it had stained hardwood furniture and runic embellishments all down the frame. They even made runes inscribed on the bolt and bolt release, something to do with making sure they never fail or explode. The exploding bit made him curious and pondered just what happened during the testing phase, but shook it from his head. From the woodwork that went into the rifle, he was almost tempted to trade his Daewoo for one of theirs. There really was something wholesomely aesthetic they'd accomplished with blending the dark dwarven steel and almost red-blonde lumber they had used for the handguard and buttstock. It really harked back to a more classic time in human history, when steel was steel and wood was wood, and those two things made up the body of a real rifle. Down the line, he saw a lot of the same, with the dwarves of the ambush instead going for the runic FALs, which also had the same runes inscribed on them and wooden furniture to boot. A few yards away was Domino and Chicks, who had somehow convinced the Oni to craft them some rustic version of a boonie hat, which currently poured rainwater onto their rifles and shoulders. Their eyes were pressed hard to their scopes as they peered through the gloom and murk of the rain, watching the road with killer intent in their eyes. Chicks and Domino were both ever keen to be in on the ambushes, even getting into physical altercations with other dragoons on who would get to go. It even got to the point that the two would even threaten other dragoons if they were too late to the meeting or sign-up call, and one dragoon had even found their rifle missing their bolt, having been taken hostage until their position was given up. Hours passed as the rain continued to pour down, and by that time the dwarven machine gunners were already on their 5th flask, both of them chuckling to each other in Dwarvish, while the other dwarven riflemen were busily rubbing oil and lubricants into their rifles to make sure the rain was kept at bay. Yule craned his head up and saw Brimtouch was making a small stick house with a valley elf, and rolled his eyes. If this was just an elaborate trap to get the 1st Dragoons and their auxiliaries extremely soaked in the rain, they should be happy with the results. Even Yule was beginning to get taxed, as he was chilled to the bone at this point, and Yethis had cuddled up so close to him that she was probably soaking up any warmth his body managed to produce. Lights. Domino and Chix said at the same time, and Yule saw their barrels slowly tracking something in the distance. Shrugging off Yethis, he crawled up the berm a little and poked his eyes over the top of it. Way out into the forest trail, he could see something akin to faintly glowing orbs popping up and disappearing through the trunks of the trees. He shuffled back down and hissed down both sides of the ambush line. "Quit fucking about! Time to do the war thing!" He forgot the word for combat in Tunka, and instead interjected what he knew. Yethis gave a snort of laughter and reminded Yule the word for combat, in which he then expounded, "Combat thing! Get ready!" in a hushed but loud tone. The last thing he wanted was for his voice to carry, but it was so loud out even with the rain roaring down around them. The Veil Riders and the auxiliaries wiggle-wormed their way up to the berm, and barrels now drew down on the road that exited out of the woods. From where they were set up, the column would have to exit out of the forest and then turn right, which would then stretch them out all along the main firing lane the ambush was going to make use of. This in turn only left the column a few decisions. They could hunker down and fight back in the open, run back into the woods and abandon the road, try and push through the ambush down the road, or try and back up their entire column. Yule expected them to flee through the forest, which only provided slight cover for the infantry, and they would have to leave their vehicles behind, which was the main objective for Yule. With the majority of the column on foot, that meant they were mostly unarmored, unlike the first ambush in which they had plenty of trucks and disembarked to avoid getting killed in them. These chosen children troopers were probably extremely green, and what that meant to Yule was that these cats would drop and look for cover as soon as the first belt of machine gun fire was ripped through. This would leave his line plenty of time to cut them down and pick them apart as they worked through their avenues of retreat. Yule got deja vu from his first ambush when he heard the rumble of engines in the distance, and he quickly scrambled up and down the line to double-check the orders he had given to the troopers and dragoons. In lead of the column was the ASV, the turret facing the front, while 3 whole platoons just strolled behind it. Behind those platoons was a Finnick, another 3 platoons, the last Finnick which towed a wagon of some sorts, and 2 more platoons behind that. All of the turrets were facing forwards, and they were moseying along at a crawl through the rain. The last Finnick didn't even bother to point its turret to the rear, and Yule snorted as he passed Domino. "Fucking amateurs." Domino smiled brightly, his teeth shining despite the gloom of the evening. "Just makes you want to teach them something new." "I'll teach them how to die like the dumb knife-ear cunts they are," Chix sneered, and heard Yethis make a scoff noise, in which she took her eye from her scope and looked at her. "Not your kind of ears, Yethis. You have long, cute ears. They have cunt ears." Yethis knitted her eyebrows at Chix and stuck her tongue out at her, which Chix answered with her own tongue and then went back to her scope. The column was now beginning to turn out from the forest and follow the road around the bend, and he heard troopers down the line double-checking their weapons. "On me," Yule hissed, and checked his own bolt to make sure there was brass peeking out to greet him in the receiver. He heard his order repeated down the line, and a lot of eyes were resting on him. "Also, don't shoot the fucking tires. Those damn things are gold," Yule reminded them, and did one more manic check up and down the line of almost his own company's worth of troopers. He was slightly winded when he came back beside Yethis, who was now shaking from adrenaline instead of the cold. "Ready, girl?" Yule asked her, and slapped her on the back to get her attention. Yethis gave a shuddered yes in return, and flicked her rifle's safety around the fire. Rain tinked on the barrels that protruded out from the berm, and Yule was getting frustrated. Even at this distance the column was hard to see, and even the keen-eyed elves were having trouble making out the figures through the sheets of rain. The longer they waited, the further the column would get down the road, and the entire ambush would be spoiled, needing to retreat all of his squads and push down to try and catch them again down the road. Just as Yule was about to wave off the ambush and tell them to retreat, there was suddenly a deafening silence. He looked around from where he was laying, and now water only dripped down here and there from the trees instead of pouring down from the sky. He crawled up and peeked over the berm to see the column was doing the same and had actually halted just inside their ambush corridor. He could hear them laughing even from here, and speaking in their southern dialect. Hey look, it's like the rain just turned off, one chosen child cried out, and he laughed along with his platoon mates as they all shook their rifles clear of the rainwater. From the hatches of the vehicles, the drivers' heads popped out, having risen their seats up so they could drive while being able to get some fresh air. It was the first time Yule had seen their uniforms clearly, and they were wearing some kind of dark green digital camouflage that reminded him of Tiger Stripe a bit, and then heard the scritch of a Velcro pocket being undone. Yule pointed at Domino and whispered, "Confirm targets." Domino panned left and right quickly, grimacing hard and focused before whispering back, "They're all elves from what I can see. They ain't none of ours, and they have UN markings. Oh look, one actually says unseen." Yule hadn't waited for him to finish, having high-crawled all the way up to the top of the berm after Domino had said, "None of ours," pressed his free hand on top of his handguard, and rotated his selector switch to its third setting. Fockett had asked why Yule's K2 didn't have an auto-sear like the other rifles, and said he was more than happy to put one in himself if Yule wanted one. A crisp click of the trigger broke the air as Yule slammed the mechanism back, and his rifle spewed Dwarven 5.56 in full auto down at the platoon that was behind the second Finnick. Brass sang through the air as the bullets cracked out of the barrel, slamming into the bodies of the chosen children troopers and showering mud everywhere as they impacted the road. Many of them were still looking up at the sky as steel shot ripped through their flesh and rent apart their bodies. The magazine went quickly, and Yule dropped the empty vessel with the depression of his mag release, then clicking a fresh one into the magwell with smooth and professional precision. Domino and Chicks fired their first salvo right after Yule opened up, and Yule saw two of the drivers flop over in their seats, the rounds having spliced right through the sides of their heads and showered the hatch next to them in brain matter. A split second after the two snipers, the Veil Riders opened up and rained hell down on the convoy. The auxiliaries were caught off guard, but snapped back to reality and joined in on the gunfire. The dwarves bellowed out war cries as they fired their weapons, the machine gunners laughing as their M240 Bravo barked out its challenge to the other rifles around it. Yethis was frozen, looking from Yule to the elves dying in droves below. Yule looked over at her, pressing the bolt release of his rifle in a slammed tone, startling water off the rifle as it vibrated its frame. "Yethis! Fire your weapon, Yethis!" he barked, and Yethis looked to him wide-eyed. Yule reached over and hefted Yethis up towards him by her harness, making her squeak in shock as she was dragged a few feet up and over where Yule was. From this vantage point, she could really see what was happening down below. Water and mud leaped and danced off the ground as rounds impacted, and elves were falling and screaming all over the road. True to Yule's predictions, they had no idea how to react to the sudden ambush, and had dropped right onto the road, firing wildly at the flashes in the distance. Dirt and mud spacked and thwacked here and there along the ambush line, but their fire never ceased into the damned souls below. "Your weapon, Yethis, use it! Fire your weapon, just like I showed you!" Yethis looked at Yule, then shrugged down behind her rifle, looking down the sights. Unlike Yule's eyes, Yethis had a heightened sense like most elves did, allowing her to focus deeper and see farther to a more accurate degree. She trained her sights along the column, the black lead post swaying back and forth. Beside her, Yule resumed firing in bursts, and she could see his tracers trailing along the bodies. She watched the elves below dive and shrink away from the rounds, as well as the ones who were too slow screech in shock as the rounds pierced through them. She saw the dwarves trail one elf who was running, the 240 Bravo's stream of bullets whipping up water after the elf who was trying to sprint their way to the safety of a vehicle's rear hatch. The trail quickly caught up to the elf, and Yethis watched as her body was ripped apart by the heavy 7.62 ammunition. The elf screamed as the first few rounds tore through her leg and arm, but the scream was cut short as the follow-up rounds turned her face and head to mush. Yethis could hear her blood thundering in her ears along with the subtle ringing of the gunfire, and she trailed her sights to a small group of chosen who were trying to deploy a small field mortar. She had seen what the dwarves could do with theirs after they launched around at a goat, and wanted nothing like that coming her way. She squeezed the trigger in short bursts, and cut them all down before she was even halfway through her magazine. The first elf took one round to the throat and went down the mud, rolling and kicking his boots frantically as his hands clutched at the waterfall of blood that poured out from his neck. The second elf took all of hers in the chest, slumping forward and falling over the mortar tube, smashing it into the road. The third elf turned to run, and Yethis shot him in the back twice, watching him land heavily onto the road, splashing in the water to move no more. When she looked over to Yule, he was grinning at her, having watched her the entire time she was shooting. She swallowed hard, her ears twitching, before she grimaced and went back to her sides. Yule gave her a pat on the shoulder, yelling, "Keep it up, Slayer!" before dropping his second mag to load in a fresh one. After locking it into place, he ran down the length of the ambush line, watching how all the troopers were operating. The dwarves were all having a real time of it, roaring and shouting curses as they fired. The Oni and Valley Elves all had this kind of business face on, quiet and working away at the triggers of their rifles as if they were fussing with just another tool in the workshop. The brim touched, they all seemed to be grinning in a malicious way, and Yule watched them slowly pick off runners who tried to make a break through the forest. That's rough, Yule thought, before checking on his dragoons, who were all spending more time coaching the auxiliaries around them than actually firing. He popped his head back up and made a painful face at what he saw down below. All of the vehicles were not moving, not even the turrets had spun their direction, and he saw that all the hatches were open. Probably because the crews decided, fuck this, and bailed. The road itself was littered with the dead and the dying, who wailed or clutched at their wounds. Yule ran his eyes up and down the road and saw that anything that wasn't dying in the mud had made a break for survival, and no longer did they have incoming fire from the road. He waved his hand back and forth to signal them all to cease fire. Cease fire! Cease fire! Give me a team on Overwatch. Everyone else, get down there and secure those vehicles. If there's anything left alive, keep it alive. We need prisoners for answers. Casualties were light for the Veil Riders in this ambush, only suffering minor grazes and gunshot wounds due to their slight elevation and natural cover of the berm. One Veil Rider had a graze on the side of his head and was rattled pretty hard by the concussion of it, but seemed to be doing fine in the hands of the healer corps. The dwarven machine gunners and the sharpshooters were set up high and hard on the berm while everyone else walked down towards the road, weapons held at the high ready as they approached. The scene below was just another slaughter, and Yule clicked his tongue distastefully. None of the chosen children troopers had even tried to defuse the ambush, and many had died where they laid or stood. He even saw that most of them had smoke grenades, and quietly pondered if they had been trained at all besides basic soldiering. Yule spun around as he heard fresh gunfire bursting behind him, and brought up his rifle in time to empty a whole magazine into a chosen trooper that had been playing possum on the road. Before Yule ended him right then and there, the trooper had rolled over and gunned down 2 Veil Riders and 3 Valley Elf auxiliaries with his M4 carbine. Only one of the elves was alive, and Yethis sprinted over towards them, her boots splashing on the ground. Everyone else on the approach went down to a knee and had their rifles up, scanning for targets just as Yule had taught them. And Yule ran over to the small huddle of bodies that lay around the now dead chosen trooper. The faces of his fellow Terrans were frozen in surprise, the bullets from the burst fire rifle having killed them instantly purely by luck of the draw, impacting their spinal columns or punching right through their hearts. He had been with these Veil Riders since the beginning. Mark was a steel worker from Ohio, and Beth a coffee barista that was just tired of doing the same thing every day. Both of them looking to get in on a grand adventure. Yule reached down and closed their wide, shocked eyes, then ripped the patches off of their uniforms and tucked them inside one of his pockets. Yethis coaxed the one wounded elf back into the solidarity of this realm, and Yule turned to look at the road. He saw that many bodies were squirming or laying very still while their chests still moved, and he frowned harshly. He had intended, after the cock-up with Brita, to take as many prisoners as he could manage, and be the good guy for once. But now the idea flapped away from the window, tweeting out a bloodlusting tune. Yule turned to the Veil Riders behind him, who were trying their best not to look at their fallen comrades. He held up 5 fingers and spoke in a steely manner. "I want 5 alive. Kill the rest." Without a word more, the Veil Riders stood and began moving through the road, killing anything that was suspect and only taking what was alive and raised their hands when they approached. Yule kept count of every rifle burst as he stared down at his dead troopers, who were being made ready to be hauled back to Valhalla Hill for burial. From 69 to 64 original Terrans, Yule thought, as he kept counting the rifle reports, and looked over to see Yethis and another auxiliary help the wounded elf limp back towards the berm. The elf had taken most of his wounds to the legs and stomach, and while healed, the pain would still render his limbs difficult to use. Yule heard no more gunshots, and murmured aloud, 53 possible prisoners. A pity. Truly a pity. He turned and saw the Onian dwarves dragging along what looked like 5 mud-logged elves, 3 of which bore the red crosses of medics. The auxiliaries tossed the elves towards Yule, and they splashed down hard onto the mud and water puddles of the road. Yule slowly squatted down on his heels, and used the barrel of his K2 to lift the chin of a female, who glared up at him with ivory-white eyes. He then looked over to a male next to her, and saw that he instead had violet eyes, and heaved heavily while clutching his chest. Unlike their Valley Elf cousins, these elves had higher, more proper pointed ears that reminded him of High Elves, and fine-boned faces that harked back to space elves that are known in a popular sci-fi war game on Terra. He looked back over at the female and saw that her head had fallen off sometime during the ambush, and her copper hair was full of blood and mud, which streaked down her face in ugly swaths. Their eyes did indeed share the same ethereal almond shape of the Valley Elves, but theirs were so much more sinister in their complexion, angled in a way that gave off constant aggression. "Curious," Yule murmured, then moved his barrel away from her chin with a rasp of metal on skin. Her head bobbed, and she exhaled sharply, having been expecting a bullet to fly out from the barrel and end her. "Bag their heads and toss them in the M1117. Let's get our fallen out of this pit." And that's the end of this chapter of the Veil Riders. Hopefully next week I can do a novel split where we have Veil Riders on Monday and this new story on Friday. Hope you guys enjoyed, and if you did enjoy, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, as well as click the bell icon so you know when each chapter of every story is released. Additionally, please spread the story to those who you think might enjoy it. After all, the best kind of story is one shared by friends. And until I see you next time on this side of the veil, this has been Guardbro.